Active planet cycles for our times. I hope you'll enjoy this visual presentation I put together for you, which will provide insight regarding what cycles are active at this time in history. Often when we look to astrology, we're looking at what's going on now, and we're looking exactly at where are the planets today, and that's all good and fine. But in order to have a deeper understanding of what's going on from the perspective of the cycles of the planets and astrology, it's better to step back a bit and see when did the cycle begin. That basically creates a frame, a frame of time. So we're going to look at a series of cycles with various durations of time, some large, some small, at least smaller. And you'll, by the end, have a clearer sense of what's going on in terms of planetary cycles and how it works, how the planets play such a vital role. People often refer to astrology from the standpoint of the signs or the stars, but actually it's all about the planets. The planets are very much the actors in the play, and that's where our main attention goes. The signs, yes, are the themes, and the aspects that the planets make between one another can be deemed as the plot, and the houses, you've heard of that, are the setting, but the planets are the actors. And so that will be the focus for today. Now, the main planet always is the planet Earth, from where we experience the planets orbiting us. So although we know technically, linearly, factually, that the sun is at the center of the solar system, our experience of existence comes from our place on the planet itself. So that's why in astrology, the Earth is positioned at the center. It's called geocentrism or geocentric chart. And so it's very much about our own experience of existence. And so we see the planets orbiting around us. And that experiential fact is very, very important. And it refers to a deeper theme of that we have consciousness and we live in consciousness. And that's where astrology gets really interesting, where we come to understand that there's a deeper rhyme and reason, that we are conscious sentient beings living in a conscious universe. Consciousness, it's the great debate of our times, by the way, to come to decipher whether consciousness precedes matter or matter precedes consciousness. And the metaphysical, spiritual side of the argument says consciousness precedes matter, and the more materialistic science says that matter precedes consciousness. So it's a rather great debate of our times if you're not aware of that yet. Now, as far as the deeper implications of consciousness preceding matter, which is what we agree with or recognize with astrology, etc., is that there's this principle of a plan, and the plan incorporates a design, and the design represents a blueprint, and the blueprint can be described as archetypal. So the archetypes of creation representing the blueprint are the pieces of the plan. And often people think of archetypes more like, king and queen and so forth, where in the deeper reaches, in their more essential expression, that's very much about shapes, the design of existence. And within that, we can understand laws and principles. These laws can be deemed cosmic or spiritual or material, celestial, if you like, and so on. So the idea is that clearly nature is designed with intelligence, and that's where we get this deeper understanding of the word synchronicity. Synchronicity basically means meaningful coincidences, or events that coincide and thereby have meaning. Now, we're not just talking about two things crossing path in front of us. Astrology studies that certain events or certain types of experiences will occur at certain times, and that principle of being able to see what's happening, that insight or that forecasting, is based on this principle of synchronicity. Now, cycles can generally be understood to begin at three key times. The first is when a planet enters Aries. Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, so it's natural to understand that when a planet enters the first sign, it begins a new cycle. The second is when a planet enters its own sign. Each planet rules a sign of the zodiac. So say Mercury rules Gemini, so when Mercury enters Gemini, it begins a new cycle from that perspective. The third is when a planet conjuncts another planet. That means two planets, basically. We can say three. A third one could come in there. It can be a three-planet conjunction, but generally, when you get right close to it, it's always two planets making a conjunction. Even if a third came in, it would be off by even a few minutes, but that would count as slightly different. Just that would create its own cycle with one or both of those planets. So two planets come together, creating a conjunction, and that means they are in alignment in the sky in the same position, basically. Now I say basically because one could be higher by declination than the other, or latitude, or one will be higher, one can be lower, but from the longitudinal perspective they'll be in alignment. So that's the basic understanding of that. Now cycles also can be understood to happen on a personal level. That means, in our own personal astrology, when do they occur? And there's a bit of an overlap between the general and the personal. So when a planet in transit, that means real time, or as you'll see on the bottom, planetary cycles can also be measured, and time, therefore, can be measured in different ways in astrology. These are basically described as progressions, directions, and returns, in addition to transits. We won't go into that right now, but you just get an idea that there's more than one way of measuring time, which is really interesting itself, and it lends a little bit of insight that time, as we understand it, is a relative illusion measured by the orbiting cycles, by the cycles of the planets in the solar system. That's how we measure time. It's very experiential. There's nothing absolute about it, you might say. It's very subjective based on our experience of the Earth spinning on its axis, and the moon orbiting the planet Earth, and the Earth itself orbiting the sun, even though we apparently experience the sun orbiting the Earth. All of these fundamentally describe our seconds, minutes, hours, days, and months, and years. So that's very interesting. That's what time is. It's not a dimension, as has been often suggested. I would offer it's a relative illusion based on our experience of the motions of the cycles of planets. It really does come straight down to that. Now, the second is when a planet enters a new sign. So we said that we see the crossover with, excuse me, we see a crossover there with the other. And then when a planet enters a new house, that's more personal, subject to our personal chart based on our time and place of birth. Then when a planet in transit conjuncts another planet in transit, that means, again, the two planets can form a conjunction in the sky. And fifth, when a planet conjuncts a natal planet. Now that's especially important. The planet conjuncting the ascendant is very personal. Planet entering a new sign is more collective, but it has a personal effect. A planet entering a new house is very personal because the houses are depending on our place and time of birth. A planet conjuncting another planet in transit is more general, but has a personal effect because it happens in a certain sign and in a certain house in our chart. Okay. And then a planet conjuncting a natal planet, that's very significant, and it begins a new cycle in our life and will be experienced as some kind of new beginning. That's the synchronicity of that. Now, every cycle can be understood to have like an anatomy. It's a metaphor here. So we can look at what's called a moon phase mandala, which I will in a moment, actually. But a moon phase mandala can be seen to have these component parts. Basically, what it's going to come down to is this, is that the cycle has 4 main points. Just like on a clock, there's 12, 3, 6, and 9. They're the quarter points. And the same with the moon having a new waxing half or first quarter, full waning half or last quarter, and then new again. They have 4 main quarters. We can also see that in the solstices, summer and winter, and the equinoxes, spring and fall. And so it works like that. We have basically, we can understand that There's 4 main stations in a cycle, and these are when the real action occurs. Now, this chart will take it that much more into detail. Now, what this shows is that division of the cycle into 8. So it shows that the 4 main corners have midpoints or stations. It would be, you can understand that well as the midpoint of a season. So if you were to align the winter solstice, for example, with the new moon and 12 midnight and conjunction, which is exactly correct, and then spring equinox would be the waxing square, 6 a.m., and autumn equinox, yes. Then you see you have the solstice and the equinox creating the season of winter, in fact, and the midpoint would be right in the middle date between the two. So that's where you get the 8. And this is otherwise known as the 8 phases of the moon. Now, just quickly, what you'll see is there's a rather generic pattern. So like a conjunction occurs, which again is symbolic in its deeper sense of new moon, winter solstice, 12 midnight. 12 midnight technically is the beginning of the day. That's why we say 12 midnight. But you see, it creates like a theme of germination, rebirth, vision. So it's like a seed that has entered into its initial gestation phase and goes through a process. So it's very organic. When you understand astrology as having an organic principle of language, you begin to understand better. This is basically stemming from the earth, air, fire, and water element principle, and then the cycle has this very much theme of the seed becoming the flower bearing fruit, the fruit coming to ripe, and then the ripening leading to other phases of either consumption or production. Then it turns to seed again, in the casting off phase. Then it goes into a dark dormant phase. Then it begins a new cycle again. So it's very organic, and that's one of the beautiful things about astrology in that way. Now, in the bigger picture of things regarding cycles, I thought I would include the age of Aquarius. So basically, most of us understand that we're in the age of Aquarius. And an age, which is 1/12 of what's called a precessional cycle, is a 2160-year period approximately. And that's 1/12 of what is approximately 25,000 I think, of 950 years or so. 910 years, I think, is the right word. It's about 26,000 years, but 25,910 or something has been the current guesstimation, which is probably quite well calculated. So just know that it's about a 26,000 year cycle, what's called a precessional cycle. That's an entire round of ages, and an age is a 2160 year cycle. Wow. So that's a long period of time, and we're just in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. So that's the first big cycle to give consideration to, of course, in the age of Aquarius. And what does that imply? Well, many things, really, many things, but Aquarius is a revolutionary time where it's very much focused on rights and, democratic rights of the people. It's very political in that regard, but it's also very, not surprisingly, inventive, technological, and social. So we see that, of course, unfolding in the world. So, I would offer that the age of Aquarius began in the 90s, just before the new millennium, and very much synchronized with the emergence of the internet as public domain, which occurred in the early 90s, by the way. Now, another large cycle to give consideration to is Neptune conjunct Pluto. That's a just shy of 500-year cycle, 495 years. So we're seeing the big picture now. Now, what's most interesting is the most recent event occurred in about 1822. Okay, so now the Pluto conjunct Neptune, this long cycle, has within it really what amounts to be a 4,000-year period. Now, what's interesting is I looked closely at the date, and I brought up what's called the Mayan dream spell calendar to see how it aligned with it. The Mayan dream spell calendar, by the way, is very much aligned with the Gregorian calendar, which is linked to Western astrology. Anyway, the poem reads like this. The yellow galactic human I harmonize in order to influence, modeling wisdom. I seal the process of free will with a galactic tone of integrity. I'm guided by the power of intelligence. I'm a galactic activation portal. It's very powerful what it suggests, and so it's very much a theme of our times that we're awaking to our larger consciousness. Now, it's been since then that that last conjunction of Pluto and Neptune that we have experienced the awakening to the realization that we are actually living in a galaxy, and the galaxy is not the universe. The galaxy is just one, not just, but because it's big, but from the standpoint of the size of the universe, which we now understand, and the amount of galaxies that are said to be contained within it, which, you know, I mean, to even say billions is kind of a guess, because could be quadrillions. We're not really sure, and some might say they are, but I'm not sure if they know. They're sure. But there are theories, and the main point is that we live in a galaxy, and it's so interesting that this pointed to that, and it's not what certainly wasn't created to surround that kind of thinking. So now it's interesting to note that the Neptune-Pluto conjunction occurs in the same sign 8 to 9 times before entering the next sign. This is really interesting, and as you'll read closer, it occurs, the current rhythmic pattern in Gemini, it's in Gemini, began in 1398 and will complete this pattern after 9 conjunctions ending in 5339, according to our current calendar count. Okay, so almost 4,000 year cycle that occurs between between Neptune and Pluto. Neptune and Pluto form a conjunction almost every 500 years. But it's interesting that it will form a conjunction in the same sign of the zodiac 8 to 9 times before entering the next sign. So it's a large evolutionary principle. The main thing for now is that it's a feature of this larger backdrop, and I just read the poem, and it's suggesting very much an awakening, as I'll show you just one more time, to us as galactic citizens. We understand we're citizens of a galaxy, and there are many galaxies. So it's really mind-blowing. Something our, ancestors, even from the 19th century, the 1800s, could scarcely even imagine. It took until, at least the 20th century and the early 1900s when Edwin Hubble made the first discovery of galaxies, etc. So it's really wonderful and exciting, and a bit of synchronicity just to take away that way. On the bottom here, I was just playing with the understanding that the age of Capricorn dawns in approximately the year 4150. So that's pretty big time frames, right? And you think, oh my God, how does this even relate? Well, it just gives you a larger sense of time. And that's what's beautiful about it. And so you can imagine we're just at the dawning of the age of Aquarius. We got a long way to go in that context. So we might as well get used to that. And now, more closer to the moment, we have the planet Pluto in Capricorn. So you'll see with those dates, okay, we're back with our time frames that are meaningful to us in the now. Now, so Pluto entered the sign of Capricorn in 2008 and will stay there until 2023 before it enters the sign of Aquarius, which will be very exciting and powerful for us all. But as it is, interestingly enough, Barack Obama became the president of the United States in 2008, and that set a very powerful new precedence in the society, in the world, really, because it broke an old pattern of the white Anglo-Saxon male, white Caucasian, etc., male, although that has been replaced with who. It is interesting that it broke the pattern at that time, and Pluto in Capricorn can be understood to represent transformations of government and social structures. Now, a metaphor that's worth considering is that when a planet enters a sign and transits through it, it's like a kettle boiling, meaning it gets hotter and hotter towards the end of the cycle. Sometimes it has a big impact right at the beginning. It's true. Right at the beginning, it's something very noticeable occurs, and wow, it started. But then the aftermath. So it's like, in effect, it's like you plug in, let's say, the kettle at that moment when there's when the planet enters the new sign. It's like plugging in the kettle, and wow, you notice something has begun. But it's by the end of the sign that the kettle is whistling. So remember that, because Pluto in Capricorn represents transformation of governments and social structures, and we still have 5 years to go. So the kettle isn't quite boiling yet, but it is definitely getting quite hot. Now, Pluto in Aries. It occurred back in 1822. I see. It just made me think that the aspect of Neptune in conjunct Pluto didn't actually occur in 1822. I'm going to have a quick look at that right now and come back. Okay, yes, the Pluto conjunct Neptune cycle actually began in 1892. So I was getting those two mixed up. The Pluto in Aries began in 1822. Quickly, just back to the Neptune-Pluto cycle, which is not the last of the entire round. As I said, it's going through the sign of Gemini, and it's only the third of the 9 that are going to occur in the sign of Gemini. So we have a real long way to go with Neptune and Pluto, and I'm going to save that talk for another time, because it really does merit its own discussion. It's a really amazing theme, but it's very, very big picture, and it's something of a more advanced subject. So we'll leave that for another time. But as it is, Pluto conjunct Neptune has this very long, almost 5,500 year cycle by the time it makes 9 conjunctions in a certain sign. It's really interesting that it does that. It doesn't change signs one after another. Very rhythmic. Very interesting that it does that. And really says something deep about the bigger backdrop of our evolution, but not one that one can quickly just say this is what it is, and that's why it would be a more advanced subject. But getting back to Pluto and Aries, closer a bit to our time, when Pluto entered Aries back in 1822, it began an important new cycle. Now, if you look at the world since then, this is a kind of a bit closer to home. If you look at the world since Pluto, the planet of transformation, entered Aries, which is new beginnings, we look at how much was going on in the world in the early 1800s, and we really begin to notice that, wow, there was definitely some very powerful developments in science. The scientific revolution was raging, and it was giving rise very much to the Industrial Revolution. And that's what massively changed the world as we know it, where the labor force became much, much more focused upon the manufacturing process. So that has changed the world, and we're still in that, of course. So now Pluto in Scorpio is the planet in its own sign, and that actually occurred back in 1984, and it lasted until 1995. It was moving very quickly while in its own sign. That Pluto has a very highly elliptical orbit, so it can spend a short amount of time in one sign and a very long period of time in another, and it's very short in its own sign. So when you see a planet especially a far planet, Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto in particular, those three, they very much determine generations. We had the Pluto and Scorpio generation. If you meet some people from that generation and you were to study them closely, like in an anthropological, sociological sense, you'd really get there's something distinct about the people born during that period. And the same would be true of, let's say, the Neptune in Libra or the Neptune in Scorpio and so forth. Those are generational demarcations, each planet in each sign. Then they overlap. And I'm going to do another video on that, another presentation in the near future. So let's move on to Neptune in Pisces. Neptune in Pisces represents a strong theme that we're still experiencing. It began in 2011 and will continue till 2026. I basically refer to it as transcendence or delusion. There's a lot of promise, that possibility with Neptune in its own sign. Okay, Neptune rules Pisces, and it can definitely uplift us to new levels of spiritual awareness. And remember what I said about the planet in the sign and the kettle boiling. We have by no means come to the end of this journey. On the downside, it can also produce a lot of deception and delusion and, so forth. It's just people, perhaps you can say, synchronistically are overwhelmed by the changes in the world, and also the access to power has grown exponentially. And we can go back once again to 1822, for example, and we can see the massive shifting of power that's occurred in the world in this past almost 2 centuries. And, and it continues. So it's anybody's guess as to where the power will shift next. But one thing's for sure, it's shifting, and it's a very dynamic game board in the world at this time. So, let's see here. Neptune in Aries. Now, that goes way back to 1861, and it can be understood as the birth of new ideals and spiritual visions. Now, if you think about the world since then, and oh, by the way, it continues until 2026 before it starts a new cycle in Aries. That's the main point. But when Neptune, the planet of spirituality and higher vision, entered into Aries in the mid-1800s there, we think about the world and how much the consciousness of humanity has changed in terms of spirituality. We can see how East and West has merged, and there's every religion that's in every place. It's no longer strictly a location or cultural thing. It's now increasingly dispersed, and amidst it all, we have more mysticism, and we have more sort of alternative consciousness of all kinds, in addition to the more orthodox, traditional types of spirituality. So we really can get a sense of how much that is and has been at play. So Uranus in Aquarius, now this is even closer to date, although the cycle is over. That's when the planet Uranus, which rules Aquarius, had a cycle from 1995 to 2003. And Uranus in Aquarius is a very powerful planet to consider because it was in its own sign, and it's very revolutionary. And it's interesting to note that it occurred while we turned the millennial dial, from into this new millennium. And the new millennium is very significant in so many ways. So it's just a bit of synchronicity at the fact that Uranus was in its own sign. There's more to say about that, but I'll just leave it alone for now, and we'll check Uranus in Aries. Now, that has just completed. Now, Uranus in Aries basically can be understood to coincide with a lot of activity going on, probably very much behind the scenes, linked to computers, linked to advances in technology. The Bitcoin has become really popular during these years, and cryptocurrencies and so on. So Aries can be seen very much as a seeding time, where things get going, but they're still in their initiation. It's like if a vehicle were taking off. The Aries period is while it's from stop to acceleration, where it reaches its cruising speed. And that's where, when the planet enters the next time sign, Taurus, it enters into its cruising steady speed, whatever that generally is. Okay, so that's where things really start to move, though, when you reach that cruising rate of speed, and that's what Taurus is all about. So it just began in May of 2015, May 15th of 2018, and we'll be there also till 2026. That's another interesting little takeaway. There's a lot of activity going on between now and then. So Uranus in Taurus is introducing, we can see it with 5G, for example. It's going to change the entire world economy. This entire new internet capacity for the exchange of information. So boy, we better get ready because it's coming hard and fast. So that's a little synchronicity for that. Now, closer yet, Saturn entered Aries back in April of 1996. And so it only stays in a sign for about 2.5 years. So, but that basically, we understand once again, when a planet enters the sign of Aries, it will it creates a cycle for the duration of time before that planet enters the next cycle of Aries again. So in other words, Saturn has about a 29.5 year cycle from the Earth's perspective. So it takes, it's a 29.5 year cycle we're looking at. And where Uranus, when I was referring to Uranus having entered Aries back in 2011, it's an 84 year cycle. And goes like that. Yeah, Neptune is a 186 year cycle, and Pluto 246 year cycle. So you begin to get these long periods of time that are encompassing what's going on as the backdrop themes. Now, Saturn in Capricorn occurred back in just December of 2017. So I'm giving the dates because it's a much faster cycle, 2.5 years. So that's Saturn in its own sign. And that's rather significant. And whenever a planet enters its own sign, it's somewhat auspicious. Planet entering Aries indicates a new cycle, and it can be auspicious, but it can also, be definitely an introduction to a new theme, whereas when the planet enters its own sign, you could say that planet takes on a lot of power. It really rises to its own greater glory, and so it's quite significant, and it's positive that Saturn in Capricorn, if you have the opportunity to harness it. What it does ask for, though, by the way, and you might be noticing this, is discipline. Saturn in Capricorn says, get to work. So, we all should be a little busier with Saturn in Capricorn between now and December of 2020. And so if you don't think things are moving as quickly as they can in your life with the new developments, just be patient and persevere, and the payoff will come. All right. So a little bit down the road. Now, Jupiter ingress or entered Aries back in 1999. Now, Jupiter, as big as it is, only has a 1 year cycle in each sign, but in regards to Aries, once again, we're thinking from Aries back to Aries again, or from Aries through Pisces, which is the 12 signs. It's a 12-year cycle, just shy of 12. So we're seeing the entry of that in that previous cycle when entered Aries, yes. Now, in 2018, it will be in Sagittarius. So the Sagittarian entry of Jupiter in its own sign is rather significant. So we're going to see that at the end of this year. So it's really great because it implies, a very euphoric, expansive, and, as in the most positive sense, exciting period of time. So it's interesting because Jupiter will be in its own sign, Sagittarius, while Saturn's in its own sign of Capricorn. So that's quite auspicious socially. So there's some good things to look forward to in that regard. Now, it's also very worth noting that Jupiter will be conjunct Saturn in Aquarius in December on solstice of December 21st, 2020. What's significant about that is that conjunction only occurs every 20 years. It's very much connected to economic cycles. And this time, after for the first time in quite a long time, it's going to be conjunct an air sign, and that air sign is Aquarius. So the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius that's coming in 2020 will be very significant for all of us as it activates a major new start point for this age of Aquarius that we are in. So that's really exciting. Now, Jupiter conjunct Uranus in Pisces occurred back in 2011, and that began an important news cycle, and that cycle is approximately, I think it's about 18 years between, no, that's not true. It's longer than that. It's a longer cycle than 18 years. It's something in the 20-something, 24 years, I believe it is. Yes. And anyway, Jupiter conjunct Uranus in Pisces is rather significant. Once again, a conjunction of two planets. When Jupiter conjuncts Uranus, it's a sign of genius. And so on the high side of it, we've been seeing certainly a lot of new inventions unfolding in the world. And so we're still experiencing the waves of that particular aspect. Now, Saturn conjunct Uranus, and I wanted to bring this full circle to show you just a few final points of the synchronicity factor. Saturn was conjunct Uranus back in 1988. That's going back, so we can see how the conjunctions overlapping in this, as I've been showing you, is not very linear. We're going back and forth a bit and seeing big time frames and short time frames, and sort of getting a real understanding of the way cycles occur in all the various forms, new signs, conjunctions, and when they enter their own sign. New signs, Aries, and their own sign in particular. But actually, even when a planet enters, I didn't mention that earlier, but when a planet enters any sign, it begins a cycle through that time, but through that sign, but it's not as significant as those other ones I mentioned. So now the thing I wanted to bring to your attention here, and this is a bit of a read here, so I'll read it for you. Back when Saturn, which is the planet of structure, conjunct Uranus, the planet of revolutionary change, back in 1988, I did a little research and found that that was, in fact, not surprisingly, a crucial year. So that's the synchronicity factor. It's in the early history of the internet. It was the year of the first well-known computer virus. How do you like that? The 1988 internet worm even got a year tagged onto it in the very year Saturn conjunct Uranus. It's a bit of a very contradictory energy, very much like an oil and water kind of energy, Saturn and Uranus, but that's a gentle metaphor, actually. Now, the first permanent intercontinental internet link was made between the United States and Europe, as well as the first internet-based chat protocol, Internet Relay Chat. Now, that's the beginning of the internet, by the way. Then, the concept of the World Wide Web was first discussed at CERN in 1988. Finally, the Soviet Union began its major restructuring towards a mixed economy at the beginning of 1988 and began its gradual collapse from being a communist society to moving in the direction of capitalism now. So the Iron Curtain began to disintegrate in that year as Hungary began allowing freer travel to the West. So that's some of the synchronistic events that occurred, showing you how that works. It was the best example so far. I didn't want to spend too much time and draw it out with all the others. I'm just giving you a quick example of the cycles at play in our times and basically how it works, very much linked to planets. Now, finally, Uranus conjunct Pluto is a very significant cycle of our times. Okay, so that began in 1965, and it's a 140-year cycle. So it ends in 2104. All right, so we're gonna that cycle is at play right now. So you understand whenever there's planetary conjunctions, that it forms a background theme that will continue for the entire duration until those two planets conjunct again. I illustrate that a bit with Neptune and Pluto. And then that same would be true with Saturn, Uranus, which we just saw, and now Uranus and Pluto. Now, it's important to note that and I'm not going to do it at this time because it's too advanced to show you the chart, but I do want to just let you know that the charts, I've done close studies, and on my YouTube channel you'll see the Uranus-Pluto cycle and the gender revolution. So it strongly indicates that there's this gender revolution underway in the world, and it will continue until, once again, 2104. And it will have peak points, which the first of the square, remember the four key cardinal points in the cycle is the conjunction, the 90-degree waxing square, the opposition point, and the 90-degree waning square point. When the first waxing square occurred, which is really the activation of the next major phase, was 2012 to 2016. So it was a 4-year period, and because those planets are far and they have long cycles, so over that 4-year period, they formed 7 exact conjunctions. And that really created a lot of activity and revolution, not just referring to the Mayan end date of 2012, which is a whole other discussion, which I'll save for another time, but that we were in our society, mainly what we were observing was the emergence of a very important new phase of the feminist revolution. And in that period of time, and since and still, we're seeing, a lot of women coming forward and rather powerful and famous icons falling under the, convictions of women suggesting that, they were abused sexually, etc., etc., etc. So it's all representative of the revolution, where it's pushing for new levels of mutuality and equality and respect, and a whole new consciousness emerging because of this. And by the way, the opposition occurs. The opposition is the full moon, the peak point in the cycle. So as well as it's, there's the beginning point, the half, the quarter point, and the full point. So that's also, of course, very powerful. And that occurs in 2046, and there'll be exactly 4 hits. So we have quite a while to go, and the entire cycle only ends in 2104. So in simple terms, you know that it'll take the entire century of the first millennium, of this new millennium, the first century of the new millennium, to really provide the time frame during which the gender revolution will come to its full completion. So, there's a lot of countries in the world where it's not as strong as it is in other countries. So that's one example, because we have to think on a global scale to get the idea of what we're speaking of correct, because astrology isn't just a national focus, it's a global one. But of course, how the synchronistic effects unfold in different countries is, by the way, linked to the astrology of those countries. Now, again, that's another discussion which I'll save for another time. Now, on a final little note, I would encourage that this particular cycle is where what we're experiencing in the world right now is very much linked to that Uranus-Pluto conjunction, which has now come to square. And it's where we are experiencing a revolution where the notion of man on the planet is being replaced by the human. And the entire question of what does it mean to be human is raging in various ways. There's all kinds of revolutions occurring in this Aquarian age, and many of them will overthrow what have come to be recognized as givens. One of those is the the entire paradigm of science is being challenged by new factions of science. For example, to reconsider the physics of what have become kind of recognized as settled matters, they are not. And so we're experiencing many revolutions in this, again, age of Aquarius, and among them we see the processes of social and cultural and governmental and economic processes of equality emerging on the planet, where men and women can, have equal rights and opportunities, etc. So that's in action, and it's in process. It will take time. Be patient, but also if you're called to be a part of that revolution in a very pronounced way, well, then you are. Not everybody is, by the way. That's a really important understanding, is if you, by virtue of your destiny, you will be called to certain types of activities and involvements, and if you're not, you're not. So if you are, don't expect those who are not to be involved and interested, because they're just not destined to be. That can be hard for some people to understand, but it's a good little final takeaway. But the main point is that we're in this major revolutionary time, encompassed in the wider scheme by the age of Aquarius, and we've got a little bit of insight here. I know I went through this quickly, but I gave you a quick backdrop into understanding some of the planets at play and a little bit of how astrology works. So I hope that gave you some takeaway insights, and more specifically though, how these are applying in your life and where you are at in your destiny, and how you can, I can help you to better understand who you are, why you're here, where you're at, where you're going, what constitutes the fulfillment of your destiny. So please give me a call, send me an email. I look forward to speaking with you and sharing some valuable insights with you. So thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll look forward to sharing more with you in the future.